Oh my god, she's a weirdo.
Hello, 'tis I, fat cow. Foodie doesn't see what she did wrong. Many reactors and people on social media have explained what was wrong with what Foodie did, but Foodie's choosing not to listen. So instead, I'm going to talk about some historic words that were used to describe people with intellectual difficulties, let's say, that have since become more derogatory. Their history and why they shouldn't be used, and some other commonly used phrases that have, well, for want of a better word, some very dubious history behind them, and why probably they shouldn't be used either. We're going to have to keep in mind that the words that were medically used to describe people with intellectual disabilities were at the time, they reflected the current thinking and the science of the time, which was, for want of a better phrase, somewhat lacking, let's say, in understanding and empathy. The first classification of an intellectual disability was penned, and that word was defective. Prior to this time, people with intellectual disabilities were considered indistinguishable for one another. So they were classified as having one thing, but with varying levels of impairment. As medicine progressed, defective came under a new label, actually 3 labels, to describe the degrees of impairment. And those were idiot, imbecile, and fool. And it was measured in terms of IQ. In addition to these words, simpleton was added along with cretin. And again, as things developed, the word, which you might remember if you're as old as me, being the word used in place of Down syndrome, was mongoloid, which obviously, thankfully, has been all but eradicated, at least in my experience. It's a word I haven't heard for a very, very long time. Moron. Now, I've got to bear in mind, all these words were medical definitions. So, moron was for people with mild intellectual difficulties, feeble-minded. And then we have the word that has encouraged this discussion, which is retarded, which comes from the Latin retarde, which means to make slow, delay, keep back, or hinder. The term retarded replaced the words idiot, moron, and imbecile. And at the time, it was not considered derogatory. This is the early 1900s. However, in 1960s, the word became an insult, and the term mental retardation was removed by US federal law as a diagnosis, as a phrase to be used medically in any official documentation, be it medical record, law, anything, was removed in 2010. The term retardation has been replaced by law with the phrase intellectual disability. And in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association dropped the word from the fifth revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is no longer considered by law in America as a medical term. It is now purely derogatory. The issue we have with this word being used in the vernacular is that when you call somebody the R word, you are suggesting that the person that you're insulting is an individual who is stupid or uncoordinated or is somewhat less than. And by doing that, you are suggesting that people with a disability are also stupid and flawed, which leads to a stereotype. In layman terms, Foodie, if I call you a pig, I am comparing you to an animal that is known to eat whatever is put in front of it, regardless of how disgusting it is, including human shit, and an animal that is historically known for smelling bad and rolling in dirt. So by me calling you a pig, I am implying all these things that are associated with the animal pig. In the same way, if you call somebody the R word, you are associating that person with the stereotype of people that have intellectual disabilities, and therefore you are stereotyping them, and you are giving people with intellectual disabilities a somewhat negative connotation, which is unfair and is ableist. Basically, what I'm saying is you are stigmatizing already marginalized people by using that word. And that when you attack a person based on their physical or mental abilities, in place of actually expressing a logical argument or an idea, you are further stigmatizing people with these disabilities. Incidentally, if we are going to go down the politically correctness route of words that are ableist, other words that came up in my research, words that I have actually used myself and hadn't given much thought to, include insane, moron, lame, idiot, imbecile, cripple, invalid, calling somebody mental, crazy, dumb, psycho, or weird. That is just food for thought. It obviously doesn't necessarily hold the same connotations as the R word or the other word that is used sometimes, which is spaz, which is a shortening of the word spastic, which refers to people that have cerebral palsy. It's something to think about. It's something that quite possibly these words in future will also be considered derogatory, and people who respect other people will take this into consideration. Just because it was a word you used to use doesn't mean it's a word you can use now. When I was a child, a man who forced his wife to have sexual relationships with him was doing nothing wrong, and it wasn't considered a crime. So just because it was okay when I was young means it's okay now? No, that's not how things work. I don't know if I explained this very well, but an attempt was made. But while I was doing the research on this, I came across many commonly used phrases that also have very dubious and sinister histories as to why they become phrases that we use. And so I shall mention them because, one, it's interesting, and two, it might be something you'd want to consider in future. Peanut gallery, which is something you refer to with your critics who you consider not particularly bright, let's say. Well, it comes from the time where theatres had the booths that were very, very high up and very, very far back and were considered the worst seats in the house. And at the time, these seats were only sold to black people. You can see where the controversy comes. A basket case. Now, this one I found particularly interesting because it was so unexpected. But to call somebody a basket case has nothing to do with any historic usage in reference to intellectual disability or mental illness, let's say. A basket case was used in the First World War to refer to a soldier who had lost all his limbs in an incident and therefore had to be carried in a basket. Rule of thumb. Now, I knew this one. The rule of thumb was this. In the medieval times and for a while after, a man was allowed to beat his wife with a stick as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. Drink the Kool-Aid. Now, we've heard Foodie say this many a time, and we all know that the drink the Kool-Aid is in reference to the People's Temple and their leader Jim Jones, who coerced his followers to commit mass unaliving by drinking Kool-Aid that was laced with cyanide and other drugs. So when Foodie tells somebody to drink the Kool-Aid, she's basically telling them to unalive themselves. A cat's got your tongue. Now that one I didn't know either. Basically refers to the English Navy back in the day, who used to punish insubordination by flogging the person with a cat-o'-nine tails, which often resulted in a person being practically catatonic and unable to speak afterwards. Tipping point. Now, this one is fascinating. A tipping point refers to a period of time in the 1950s and 60s where white families would come to the point where they would decide to leave a neighbourhood because too many black families had moved in. Grandfathered in. Now, I've heard Foodie say this one too. In the 15th Amendment, people would be tested, men would be tested in their cognitive abilities to vote. You would have literacy tests to see if you were able. And to grandfather in refers to the 15th Amendment of racial discrimination in voting, where poor white people who would have failed the literacy test were able to vote if they could prove they were descendants of legal voters, which excluded black voters who couldn't prove that they were descendants of legal voters. Off the reservation refers to the Native Americans that were forced off their own land onto government-owned land, and also refers to how any Native American that was found off their area would be automatically killed. Very similar in a way to the phrase sold down the river, which would refer to a particular punishment that was given to slaves who would be punished by being sold down the river to a plantation that was arguably worse than the one they'd come from. Uppity. Uppity Was historically used in the South to describe black people who didn't know their place. So what I'm basically saying is there are a lot of words we use that we probably don't know the history of, and there are a lot of words that we use that we know shouldn't be used, but to claim that I've always used this phrase, therefore I can't help it, is basically announcing to the world that I cannot develop, I cannot grow as an individual, and that I have no empathy towards anybody. To say it's out of your hands to learn not to use certain phrases is admitting that you are incapable of improvement. When I was a child, teachers were allowed to hit you with a ruler. That doesn't mean it's acceptable now. Things change, things develop, we progress. You are admitting, Foodie, that by being unable to progress past your history and experience of using certain words, that you are somewhat unable to or unwilling to make the changes that would just make life in general a little bit nicer.